Thank you. My section has to do with the do's and don'ts of rulemaking, so if you'll turn to that right now. How many of you have been involved in a rules enforcement case? May I see your hands? Okay, how many of you have been involved as owners, as board members? Okay. Since the majority of you have not, what I would like to do with my section is go through the creation of rules so that you can avoid being in a dispute about rules going forward. The board is, as we have heard, the governing body of the association. And so with the board, you have the executive, the legislative, and judicial branches all rolled into one. And with great power comes great responsibility. In essence, the board sets the culture for the project. What kind of place is it? Is it going to be the type of project that just is very stringent on the enforcement of the rules? Or is it going to be a pleasant place that is reasonable and tries to create an atmosphere that is harmonious? It's a place. Is this the kind of project that you would want to live in? And if the answer is yes, then you're doing a good job, because in essence, that's what makes a project, valuable, and the prices will rise. Rules are sometimes called house rules, covenants, and you will find them in the project documents, and they vary in different communities. Rules and restrictions are designed to basically enhance property values, as I alluded to. It sets the quality of life within the community. It provides certainty and order so that you know what's expected of you, but more importantly, you know what you can expect when you buy into this project. And this is what makes a community association work. When people buy into a association and want to treat it like a single-family home and can do whatever they want, that's usually a formula for disaster for the association and the owner. The rules are also there to protect the freedom and safety of the residents. It sets the parameters, again, of how things are to be conducted. There's no association that deliberately sets forth to make rules that are controversial or vague, but sometimes it happens. And board members have a responsibility to listen to the association members to find out if something is not working, then how can we improve it? But before discussing whether a rule is legal, it should be remembered that there are three sources for rules and restrictions. The restrictions that the developer has created is usually found in the declaration. For condominiums, that's the place you would look. Restrictions added to the governing documents are usually the amendments to the declaration, and they're voted on by the members. And usually it's going to take a 67% vote to amend. And then there are restrictions created by the board. Oftentimes these are the house rules. These apply to the overall day-to-day living. But as a board member or as an owner, you need to be aware, you cannot create a house rule that does not have support in either the declaration or bylaws. You can't create restrictions just in the house rules. And let me give you an example of that. For example, there was a board that decided that they wanted to make the rentals of the units for any less than 30 days illegal. And so an owner challenged this because the owner pointed out there is nothing in the bylaws or declaration that sets that prohibition up. And so he brought suit and he won. And the court basically found that unless you have that type of restriction on renting in the bylaws, you can't put it in the house rules. And the logic for that is this. In order to amend the declaration, usually takes 67% or 75%, depending on whether you have opted into 514B. If you want to amend the bylaws, it's 67%. And that's, again, a large percentage for the ownership to change different restrictions within the project. But let's look at what it would take to amend the house rules. If the house rules can be adopted by the board, let's say you have a 9-member board, and a quorum of the board is 5. So at a meeting, let's say you have the bare quorum, 5, and then the majority of that quorum decides that they want to change the house rules. So now you're down to 3. That means if the board can just make house rule changes that affect how you can use your unit, that gives too much power to the board. So again, check your source. Make sure you have the authority to make changes. In general, courts recognize 6 criteria for determining whether a rule is valid. First question, is it legal? A rule is legal if it does not unreasonably restrict a constitutional right. It's legal if it is consistent with the project documents and federal and state and local statutes, and finally, does not exceed the scope of the board's rulemaking authority. Does it have a legitimate purpose? A rule has a legitimate purpose if it relates to the operation and mission of the association. A rule must be appropriate for the association, such as noise rules, to ensure tranquility in the project. Is it reasonable? A rule is reasonable if it is fair and sensible. It should not be excessive or petty. For example, one project adopted a rule that in order to use the guest parking, you have to get a pass 30 days in advance. Now, that's ridiculous. If you have guests coming, usually you don't know they're coming 30 days in advance. Otherwise, you could make a reason for not being there when they wanted to come. It's the morning, you're a little slow, but anyway, we'll catch up. Is it fair? A rule is fair if it does not single out or discriminate against a separate class or group of people to be treated differently without reason. For example, a rule prohibiting tenants from using the recreation room is unfair, and tenants are not to be treated as any type of subclass of humans. Is it enforceable? A rule is enforceable if it can be applied uniformly rather than selectively or arbitrarily. Here's an example of what I would call a lawyer's delight. The rule read, no unattractive yard art will be placed in the front yards. That would prohibit some of the owners from being in the front yards. Okay, we're getting better. That's good. Is it clear? A rule is clear if it is stated in a way that eliminates ambiguity and confusion to comply with. Be practical when adopting, for instance, a noise rule. If you say you may not exceed 8 decibels from 10 in the evening to 10 or 8 in the morning, well, that's a very precise rule, but is it practical? Who walks around with a decibel reader? So it just is very difficult. Oftentimes, you have to apply common sense, which is, again, somewhat arbitrary. Early in my practice, I represented this condominium, and the board got a complaint from an owner who happened, unfortunately, to be an attorney. And he was complaining that there was this whirring sound that made it impossible for him to get a good night's sleep. And so they sent the resident manager up, and he could not hear anything. He even put his head down on the carpet to listen. And then he finally determined that the whirring sound was from a fan that the owner had below. And so this is what he reported to the board. Based on that, the board went back to the attorney and said, we're really sorry, but there's no noise violation. It's basically it's a whirring fan, and he has a right to have a fan in his bedroom. And so we are not going to take any action. Well, then they got a complaint from the owner that had the whirring fan causing that noise, that at 3 in the morning he would hear this thunderous noise. And then it would happen periodically thereafter, and so he couldn't really sleep either. As it turned out, the attorney was dropping a bowling ball on the floor. Honest, I don't make these things up, but that's what keeps us in business. Okay. The best practice is if you're going to adopt a rule and you're not sure whether it's legal and functions the way it should and is above challenge, the best thing you can do is submit it to the association council, because if you're having doubts about it, then have it checked out by an expert. And if, as John says, you want to do it on the cheap, maybe you can think about it this way. Ask yourself, is this a rule that Donald Trump would support? If the answer is yes, it's probably illegal and you should submit it to council.
So bad.
I did that for an ABC's program I did for CAI last year, and then one of the evaluations that came in said, well, he was basically good, but he should not have gotten political. So anyway, but that's, I'm sort of like Don Rickles, who just passed away. We tend to offend everybody. The procedures for developing rules. Identify or confirm the community's authority to make a rule. Check your power source. Make sure that you have the right to do it in your documents. And when necessary, consult with association counsel. When it comes to house rules and updating the house rules, the most economical way I think you can do it is the board can go through and look at whatever amendments they want to make. And then when they have done that, then send it to council for review, because then you minimize the role of council in the review. And that's, again, the most economical way of doing it. Evaluate the need for the rule. Ask, why is this rule important? Avoid knee-jerk reactions. Don't make a rule just because somebody comes in and complains. Research, is there a need for the rule? Unfortunately, the legislature is probably the entity that creates more legislation from knee-jerk reactions. Don't be like the legislature. Review the requests, make sure that there's a need for it. The fewer rules, the better in any association, because the more rules you have, the more opportunities you have for controversy. Consider the immediate impact and long-term implications of adopting the rule. Consider how the owners and residents will react to the rule. And communication is crucial. The owners need to know what is being changed, why it's being changed. And if you tell the owners, explain to the owners why you're doing this, you have a much better chance of having the owners comply with it. As an example of this, one of the associations I represent recently adopted a rule that prohibited the feeding of feral cats. And for the animal lovers, this was not well received. But the communication with the ownership was, we are banning this because the feral cats are creating a nuisance. Their defecation and urination on cars, ruins the surface of the cars, and that's why we are banning it. And so if you communicate, as John said, with the owners, you have a much better chance of the owners complying with it. You need to, in the rulemaking, define the scope and write a draft for the rule. Keep it simple and make it understandable, easy to follow. You need to advise them of the enforcement procedures when violations occur. You have to have the due process, the right of appeal, and you also have to tell them what happens if they violate the rule, the due process is exhausted, and they are found to be in violation, what the fine will be. Verify that the rule is valid and enforceable. Again, check the power source. If you don't have the power or authority to do it, then you will not be able to enforce the rule. Give the proper notice of the change in the rule to the owners. Generally speaking, we always usually advise give at least 30 days before a rule becomes effective. If necessary, vote and approve the rule if this is required. Usually, most of the bylaws provide that the boards can adopt any rule change. All they have to do is notify the owners and allow them to come at the next board meeting and voice any concerns. Once the rule has been properly adopted, give notice, again, that this is the effective date, and you have to give notice to not only the owners, but the residents, because the residents are in fact the ones who will be required to follow it. So it makes no sense to just send it to the owners who may not be there. So once you've done all of that, then you have a set of rules that should be good to go. Thank you.